Okay, and my last thing is I am thrilled to introduce you to Michelle Trujillo. Michelle has more than 25 years of experience in education. She's an educational consultant and co-founder of the Center for Learning and Well-Being. Michelle believes in starting with the heart and the powerful role that educators play in the lives of their students. In addition to social and emotional well-being for educators, Michelle is also the author of the Corwin book, Start with the Heart, Igniting Hope in Schools Through Social and Emotional Learning. As her editor, I could attest to her wonderful skills as both an author and a person. She's one of my favorite people. And without any further ado, please welcome Michelle Trujillo.
Thank you so very much, Jessica. I want to make sure I am not on mute. I am not. And Jess, you are one of my very favorite people. So thank you again. And thank you to Corwin for offering this webinar. I have to always start with gratitude, not just for Corwin, but especially for each and every one of you that have joined this webinar. We were actually thrilled and surprised at the number of people that registered today, because we know how much you have on your plate. And as Jess said, I am a teacher. I was a principal for over 25 years, primarily in the realm of alternative education. And so I see you, I know you, I've been there. My heart is still there in the work that I do with students and educators today as a professional learning facilitator and as a, what I like to call, an advocate for hope. So with that, and from that perspective, I want to thank you for all you are and all that you do as educators. And I know that you already know this, but I want to remind you, a positive school culture is anchored in a way of being that truly begins with you. And it's important that we understand, that we remember this reality and that we really focus on gratitude, because our understanding of the reality today is heavy. If we even look back to, let's say, 2017, pre-pandemic, shortly after I retired from being in the classroom and in a school, I would go work with the educators, and it didn't matter where I was, anywhere across the nation. People would say, we are seeing more behaviors at younger ages than we've ever seen before. We know during that time, 2 or 3 years ago, there was a need for mental health support like we'd never experienced before in education. If you can agree with that, or that resonates with you, can you give me a little yes, or I remember in the group chat? Also, back at that time, just watching the news made it very evident to us that school safety issues were growing. Every year, we were seeing more concern. We knew that chronic absenteeism nationwide was an issue, and the opportunity gaps and disproportionality that really highlighted the inequities within the educational system, they were huge. And this was, I love seeing all those yeses. Yes, you all know, this was pre-pandemic. Today, in the midst of the pandemic, we see more of all of these things. We know that our students are impacted by this pandemic. They're experiencing trauma and grief and a social immaturity that comes with not having those typical interactions with their peers. They are impacted. But the truth of the matter is, the reality is, so are we as educators. So are we. We know that this pandemic has impacted teacher mental health. And I see the word teacher in this survey I'm going to share with you is specifically related to teachers, but I also want you to know that I talk about educators, because educators really, they represent all of us, from principals to custodians to counselors to superintendents, district office personnel, paraprofessionals, school social workers. If you're working in the library or in the lunchroom, It doesn't matter if you strive to meet the needs of the students and the families within your school community, then as far as I'm concerned, you are an educator. And this pandemic, I am certain, and I include myself in that as a professional learning facilitator, this pandemic, it impacts us. This study from the CDC, or this survey, is just one example of the impact that we see on teacher mental health. This was back, I believe, in March of 2021, just last year. And what they found was that 20% of teachers self-reported that they were experiencing consistent symptoms of clinical depression, or symptoms that were consistent with clinical depression. And the reason they said it that way is because these were self-reports, but when they listed their symptoms, they aligned with depression. 30%, 37% aligned with anxiety. And 19% of the teachers surveyed said that they had begun drinking during the pandemic, or that they were drinking more. And some of you out there might be thinking, I might see yeses in the group chat for that too. You might be thinking, well, that's not a bad thing, right? And it's not in most cases. But if we are drinking to cope, altogether, that is something different. And so we know that there's an impact on our well-being. We also found this over the last year. 53% of the teachers surveyed in this study said, we actually are thinking about leaving the profession or retiring early, so much more than we would have had the pandemic not occurred. And it doesn't matter where I go. I see this quote here from this focus group, and I hear it all the time. Teachers are leaving the profession. Administrators are leaving. Superintendents. I just heard a statistic last week. There's a new survey out that's showing superintendents nationwide, like 40% of them are saying, I'm done. This is too hard. But I see Angela there says she's counting down until 20 years. She's sticking it out. But Alessandra says it's so true, and it's sad. So we know we love our vocation, but we also know that today educators are feeling overwhelmed. They're feeling frustrated, exhausted, and ultimately, they're feeling burnout. In fact, I'd like to do something right now. Melissa, can you help us? I have a poll, and I'd just like to bring this home a little bit to our participants on the webinar today. How are you feeling today? If you were to think about yourself or educators in general within your school community, and know that this is actually an anonymous poll, so you're not outing yourself here, but what are you feeling? Are you feeling calm, energized, prepared, uncertain, frustrated, overwhelmed? Or I also left an other category there. If something else, another word came to your mind. Melissa, let's give about 10 more seconds, and then let's show the results. Just considering the people on this webinar today, what are we feeling, or what are we seeing out there in our schools? Can we show those results? I hope you all can see that. We have 3 to 4% people. Actually, if we add them together, I suppose we would say 10% are either calm, energized, or prepared. But really, the majority of people, 90% of the people that are on this call serving in the role as an educator today are feeling uncertain, frustrated, overwhelmed, or another word that came to mind. Thank you for that, Melissa. The reality is we are burned out. It amazes me that 51% of the people said overwhelmed. But it probably doesn't amaze you because you're living it. You understand. If you chose another word and you want to throw it in the chat, feel free to do so. We've all seen several of articles that have come out over the last 6 months talking about teacher burnout. In schools, we know this. There is a lack of capacity. There's a lack of physical capacity. We have limited subs. And as a result, regardless of the role that you serve as an educator, you are often being asked to cover for other people physically. So that time that you had yourself, that time maybe that you would have taken a deep breath, or that you would have worked on a lesson plan. If you're a teacher, maybe you're rushing off to do something else. We also see lack of capacity emotionally and in regard to our actual instructional practices, because we have student behaviors that tend to be incredibly socially immature and potentially and often rooted in trauma. We have instructional loss. People talk about learning loss, but we have learned so much over these last 2 years. But there truly is instructional loss. There has been, and there continues to be. With all the efforts we're making to mitigate it, we still have teachers out because they're sick or they've been exposed, and the same is true of our students. And then our educators have to live life too. And there is stress in life today, right? I mean, some of us have dealt with sickness. Some of us are concerned about our families. Some of us live in families where people have lost income. There's daily stress that tends to be overwhelming. I am wondering if I can give you a visual here that might resonate with you. Just take a look at this. Sometimes when I talk to educators, when I work with them, it makes me think of this little bear right here, up against all odds, trying to hold on. Oh, being resilient. I can do this. I got it. I love my vocation. But it's so hard, right? Here I am. I think I've got it. I've got someone up there cheering for me. We know this too, but wait, right? Charlene in the group chat says, you're preaching to the choir. I know. Every person on this call is living exactly this. And so I am here in this first moment to validate you, to say, I get it. It's hard. It's true, our vocational roles and responsibilities are challenging. And I use the word vocation intentionally. We don't go to work and do a job. We serve a vocation, an actual calling. We are educators, right? So as hard as it is, we need to remember that we are educators. We are resilient. We are creative and flexible. We are strategic. We are, in fact, igniters of hope. So as much as what we do is difficult, we serve in this role as igniters of hope. And hope is vital today. The youth and adults within our school communities, they need for us to serve in this role. Again, I know I'm preaching to the choir. You all know how much they need hope. Our colleagues need hope. But sometimes, so do we. And so the question today that I want to help answer is how, when we're in this situation where we're serving as igniters of hope, how do we sustain that role when we feel, over 50% of us, overwhelmed, exhausted, and sometimes hopeless ourselves? Before I answer that question, I want to read something from the group chat from Cynthia. Cynthia wrote this. She said, I'm a retired certified teacher, and I am working this entire year as a long-term sub. It's hard, but I know how much our teachers and students need so much help and support. Cynthia, thank you. Thank you. And Sherry, you reiterated that and told her how valued she was. We need to remind people, each other, how valued we are in what we do. Oftentimes, instead, we do this, though. We hear, you just got to take care of yourself. Or we tell someone, gosh, you got to take care of yourself. And I have to tell you, I work with so many educators that say, if I hear that one more time, I'm going to scream, right? Because there is not another thing we need to do. And that's what self-care sometimes feels like. So the reason I wrote this book, the reason I'm so excited about this book is the hope is that it will help you to take self-care off your to-do list. There are thoughts and words and behaviors that we already engage in. So instead of saying, hey, we got to take care of ourselves, let's integrate that self-care, or what I like to call compassionate action, into our very way of being. And this is a way that I'd like to introduce to you that we can do that. This is a framework that you will find within my book, Social Emotional Well-Being for Educators, that is based on 6 ways of being. It is not a program. It's rather an ongoing process to be reflective, be intentional, be empathetic, be connected, be accountable, and be equitable. These ways of being, when nourished, will help us in our own wellness and will help us to support our students in theirs. Now, you'll notice in this wheel 2 things. One, that they align with specific social emotional learning competencies. I know that so many of you out there have already engaged in integrating social emotional learning into your school culture or into your instructional practice, teaching skills to students. It's so incredibly important. But I also know this, as much as I value these 5 social emotional learning competencies, self-awareness and self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making, oftentimes educators feel disconnected from these because they feel like it's either one more thing I have to do or it's a curriculum for my students. And so what I tried to do is think about my experience, my years as an educator, as a principal, and as a teacher, and to think about the educators and the students that I work with today. And I tried to grab onto some behaviors that naturally rest within these competencies. And I want you to notice one more thing. These ways of being are interconnected. We can actually look at them in isolation, but we also have to remember we often cannot have one without the other. Before I step into the next slide, I want to read this next comment. Rona says, what is frustrating is when people tell you to implement self-care while asking you to do additional duties. I often feel like I need a day off, but then I feel guilty and know I will have just that much work waiting for me when I return. It's hard to find balance. And I'm going to tell you what, Rona, we're going to talk about balance today. And I truly believe this framework will help you to find it because, again, it's a process, and I will not in any way, I do not believe in toxic positivity. I don't want you to think that I'm going to put something out there for you that is going to be easy. Our vocation, it's challenging, and a process takes work. Here's the difference. I don't want you to add more work. I want you to look at what you're already doing. And we're going to do it in 3 ways today. I just am going to introduce some ideas. I want you to understand that each of these ways of being, this focus on 6, has a personal and professional relevance in regard to nurturing your wellness. I want to introduce to you the importance of self-reflection. And I've actually designed a check-in tool for you that'll help with that. And then finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about using the framework to nourish our well-being, to experience balance, and to seek solutions. And I hope you will all laugh with me as we look at this slide, because I went in to do a correction and I left out an E on well-being. So thank you for the grace that you are giving me in being human. Okay, let's start with the idea of relevance. Now, when you look at this framework, I want you to understand there is relevance to your life as a human and to your life as a professional, as an educator, for each of us. Now, that relevance may look a little bit different from each of us, for each of us, based on our own experiences and based on our own values. I tried to give you perspective within the pages of this book, and I want to share just one with you here. Let's look at being reflective. How is it relevant? Like, why does it make a difference if we focus on this in our personal lives? Well, from my perspective, being reflective, it leads to personal growth. Like, in this world, we all want to grow. Growth is a way in which we can actually contribute to society, right? And we cannot grow from that which we ignore. When we reflect on things, we identify things, our emotions, our behaviors, our thoughts, our attitudes. I also want you to understand that when we're reflective, we begin to notice our strengths, as well as areas in which we might want to improve. We can't leverage our strengths if we don't identify them. So that's the relevance for us personally. And you'll note that those things can be carried over professionally as well. But also, in regard to professional relevance, the ability to be reflective can help us to connect or reconnect with the purpose and meaning of our vocations. I talk a lot about remembering and renewing our why. Some of you are familiar with Simon Sinek. He wrote a book called Start With Why. And in it, he says, we can know what we're going to do. We can even know how to do it. But unless we know our why, it lacks meaning and purpose. We all need meaning and purpose in our life. Meaning and purpose leads us to hope. It moves us forward. It inspires joy and confidence, effectiveness and productivity. So we really want to look at each way of being and understand the relevance to our lives personally and professionally. That's one way in which this framework might help you. Another way is in regard to checking in with ourselves. It's one thing to say, if we be reflective and we be intentional and we be connected and so on, that we will be more well. Our social emotional well-being will be nourished. But it's another thing to say, well, what does that way of being look like in my life? What is natural to me? And what is really challenging? And so I tried to identify some specific behaviors for you to have you think about, is this something that I do well and easily, or is this something that is challenging? And what I did is I created a checklist for each way of being where you can look at it and say, gosh, yeah, that's something I can do, but this is something I don't do. And the deal is, I want you to think about this. The things that aren't natural for us, we tend to avoid or run away from, right? Instead of spending our time nourishing. The behaviors I've listed in this checklist, they will actually nourish our well-being. So the goal would be to find more behaviors or to work our lives in a way and reflect in a way that would help these behaviors to become more natural. We can only do that, though, if we identify what's challenging. Now, I've used this with schools where they can do this anonymously with a staff and be able to look at, as a school, we have people that are incredibly empathetic. There are more very natural for me check marks in being empathetic than anything else. But this being intentional this is more challenging for our staff. And in that way, we can set goals. And then we can do some progress monitoring a month down the road or a week down the road. We can look at it again and say, okay, we tried to focus on these intentional behaviors. How are we doing? Go back and check again. This is something you can do on your own time. This is something, if you don't have time to check the box, although I tried to make it so easy for you because I know how overwhelmed you are, but you could just think through these behaviors on your car ride to work, right? There are things that we can do so that it doesn't actually add more. Earlier, we talked about balance. Now, when we recognize our strengths and when we identify our areas of potential growth, we will be able to find balance. And I had this, I've always advocated for balance with educators. I work with two colleagues that have helped me really look at how does social emotional well-being create balance, right? And I'll show you that in a minute. But I had this aha in the parking lot of the store the other day. And the other day, I mean, literally 4 days ago, I run into this kid. This kid is Mikey. And I call him a kid because he'll always be a kid to me. But actually, Mikey is, I think he's 24 now, hard to believe. But I ran into Mikey and I was so excited to see him. See, Michael, just like all of my students, and I'm sure all of yours, Michael holds such a dear place in my heart. He came to me, enrolled in our school at about 17 years old. At the time, he was a young father. He had a baby at home. He was a single father, I should say. The mother was not involved in the baby's life, although his mother was helping him. But he was on his own trying to take care of this baby. At the same time, he was in a place in his life because he had his mom that he was wavering. Do I want to get serious about school, graduate, take care of my kid, be responsible? Or do I want to keep partying? Neglect school, neglect my child. In some ways, he was doing that with some of his behaviors. He just wasn't sure. He was teetering. Ultimately, he chose to be responsible and he graduated. And it was so exciting. And we talked about that. We caught up in the parking lot, but he said something that created for me this aha. And this is what he said. He said, you all, meaning our staff at our alternative ed high school, you all had a way of setting high expectations and holding us accountable, but then believing in us and loving us. Yes, we use the L word, loving us at the same time. And then he used the word balance. This kid said that balance is why I graduated. And it is what I want for my son now. That balance, right? Mikey said, it's what I want for my kid. And I went, oh my gosh, we did create that balance. It was a fine balance to be tough, to kick kids in the butt every once in a while, figuratively, not literally, of course, but to just push and set expectations, but also to encourage them, support them, and love them, seek to understand. And it helped them to find success. So I've been advocating now for balance for adults. And we think about how today so many of us feel so overwhelmed. Well, this balance may help us as well to find that place where we're nourished, where we're not so overwhelmed. Because often when life situations happen that are challenging, we tend to go into one or two responses, right? And we're all familiar with this from our schooling. We tend to go into fight or flight. This is me. I feel overwhelmed or I feel sad. And I tend to want to just run, right? I just want to run away. I go to anger. In fact, I have a hard time with sadness. So I just want to and run. Other people tend to freeze or collapse, right? Something happens. It's out of their control, like what we're living in right now. And we go into total shutdown. And really, my colleagues, Corey Hamilton-Biagas and Lori Nathanson, we came up with this diagram to really try to demonstrate that really, if we can use our tools, if we can practice reflection, if we can recognize our strengths, if we can engage in asking ourselves questions and then challenging ourselves to nourish our well-being through connection, we can find balance, right? And that balance can help us. So I want to now introduce a way in which we can find balance using this framework. And it starts with moving from deficit thinking to strength-based thinking. Really looking instead of at the problem or issue to a desired outcome or solution. And ultimately, that approach we can do through the lens of this framework. So example would be this: educators are feeling uncertain, frustrated, overwhelmed, whatever that feeling is. That would be deficit thinking, right? And we do this with our kids all the time. We try to turn what they're saying about themselves or what they're feeling into strengths. So our desired outcome instead would be educators feel invested, engaged, and prepared to do this good, hard work of education. So what does that look like in regard to our framework? Well, let me just give you one example here. And I have to apologize. I had some technical issues before we started. So we're going to start a little bit backwards here. But what we can do is this: we can look at each way of being, and we can ask ourselves some questions or engage in some behaviors or some thoughts that help us to move towards our desired outcomes. In regard to being empathetic, we can seek to understand the story behind the behaviors or ways of being of others. So often we just assume things, right? We jump into judgment. Now, a lot of us don't want to admit that. We want to say, oh, we don't judge. But think about the students who you've already made a decision about sometimes. They're apathetic. They don't care. Do we know why? Sometimes a kid shows you that he cares on one day, but then doesn't act like it 3 or 4 or 5 additional days. And so we start to judge him for not caring, when really maybe there's a story there that we need to seek to understand. When we do this, how is it relevant to our own well-being? Well, when we do this, that judgment, which creates negativity and burdens us, actually begins to lift because we have an aha about a kid. I know each and every one of you on this webinar have experienced that before. Let's go backwards a little bit here. Thanks for bearing with me. In regard to working this framework, if you are looking at ways in which to feel invested, engaged, or prepared to do this good hard work, and you are to consider being reflective, you might reflect on your why. When we reflect on our why, like I said before, it brings meaning and purpose. We might reflect on our feelings or on our behaviors in each way of being. Like, what am I really feeling here? I understand that my fists are clenched, but what's causing that? We can also ask ourselves questions to recognize our strengths and areas we may be in need of support. In regard to being intentional, here's just a few simple things. What if, after on the car ride home or the bus ride home, we thought about our why, we reflected on it? What if, when we get home, we actually share that why with someone with whom we live, with our kids or our partner, our husband? What if we share it with a neighbor? Why I chose this vocation in the first place. Sometimes we lose sight of that in all the frustrations and overwhelm. Also, what if we consider what is within our realm of control and then intentionally focus on that? Focus right there. So often we get caught up in things that we cannot control. So if we can, like John Wooden says, don't let what you cannot do Interfere with what you can. Focus on our realm of control. That's a way in which we can be intentional that will lighten our load. How about being connected? We can pursue social and emotional connection. In fact, I think we've done a disservice in society and in many of our schools. We have talked so often about social distancing. We need to change that. The proper terminology is physical distancing. We still know how absolutely contagious this Omicron variant is. So we need to be responsible and practice physical distancing. But what if in our schools, we began to call it that? We changed the posters that were on our walls and we wrote physical distancing so that our kids and our colleagues would know that social and emotional connection is more vital now than ever before and that it's important to us. In regard to being connected, we can also practice gratitude. It doesn't add more on your plate to think about one person you want to appreciate every day and just say thank you. Give the specific reason you're thanking them. Okay, maybe 15 seconds, 30 seconds, but it will bring joy to your heart and to theirs. How about being equitable and being accountable? Both of these ways of being really are reflected in responsible decision-making. We can explore our implicit and explicit biases. Now, I understand implicit bias means we don't know what our biases are. So we've got to start there. We've got to start by looking within and saying, you know what? Sometimes I make assumptions or judgments and I don't intend to. I may not even know that I'm doing it. And we can do this by talking to trusted friends. We could figure this out. Right? Or just asking people we trust, what do you see in me? Or there are also tools online. You can look up implicit association tests, and it takes literally a few minutes to go through some questions to try to identify where do I have some biases I may not be aware of. We can also be accountable by owning our part in making assumptions or judgments or poor choices, by actually seeking sincere forgiveness and pursuing intentional changes. And again, I want to say this, it's not easy, this process at all. At the same time, it is something that will make a difference in our lives if we trust it. If we trust it, we will find that balance. In fact, if we as educators are like this little bear and we choose to pursue our own well-being by considering our thoughts, our attitudes, our words, and our behaviors, things we already do, reflect on them and nourish them, we too will experience this balance and this success. So with that, I want to thank you. And I want to ask you to pick a vowel. You heard me talk about a lot of different things today, and I do realize I want to validate. I know well that I am preaching to the choir. Somebody said in group chat, yes. But what resonated with you? Sometimes when I go to a conference as a participant, the things that resonate most are things that I already know and understand. I just needed that. Yeah, I haven't been doing that lately. So what resonated with you? Is there an adjective that comes to mind that describes your learning over the last hour? Think about it. An emotion or feeling that you had while listening to me or hearing Mikey's story or watching that little bear. Was there something I said that made you curious? Are you thinking, man, I want that self-reflection check-in, or I need to check out, that idea of the balance, and I need some challenges around that. So was there something that made you curious? That would be your I. Or, oh, did you have an aha moment as we were here today? And what questions do you have? And with those questions, I'll turn it back over to Olivia.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you to everyone who's joined us and participated today. As far as Q&A, I think you were able to answer everything that we saw in the chat as it came in. We did see a ton of interest in that really great checklist. And so I do want to let everybody know we will be including a link to that checklist in the email with your certificate and the recording. But I think we can go straight to the giveaway. I'm not seeing any new questions coming in right now.
No, I do want to say, though, I saw something here. Somebody said, I love that look on Mikey's face, that smile, somebody said. And Tony, I see you. By the way, I have a former colleague that lives across the nation for me that's here today. Tony, it's so good to see you. But anyway, someone said, I really appreciated seeing that smile on Mikey's face. And I want to remind each and every one of us that our smile is so important, that we are able to smile from our hearts so that that joy can be seen in our eyes. Because when we're with our kids, oftentimes we're wearing a mask. And so that smile, Mikey's smile, made an impression on one of you within this webinar, but know that your smile is going to make an impression on others. Sorry, Olivia, but I had to add that.
No, no worries at all. Thank you. And of course, if you do have any questions for Michelle that didn't get answered for today, feel free to send your questions to us. You can send them to info@corwin.com. And we'll send them on to Michelle and get those answered for you.
Thank you all for coming today.